Okay, everyone, we're going to get started. Welcome to everyone in the room. Thank you so much for being here, and to everyone joining us online. I'm Charmaine Nelson. I'm a Provost Professor of Art History at UMass Amherst in Massachusetts. And I'm also the founding director of the Slavery North Initiative. Now, what is Slavery North? I'll give you the short version. So Slavery North, because most of you already know. So Slavery North is an initiative which is the first step to becoming an institute or research center. And what we do is support and amplify, bring together scholars, artists, students, and professors who are working in the fields of studying Canadian slavery and slavery in the US North. And one of the things that we do is offer fellowships to all those categories of people, to bring them here, to be in residence with us, to be in conversation with each other, and then to support and grow these understudied fields. So I just want to acknowledge one of our wonderful fellows is in the room, Professor Girati, if you could wave. Julia Girati is a professor of philosophy at UMass Amherst, and she's also a fellow with us for an entire year, I believe. Right, Julia? Fantastic to have you here. So I'd also like to introduce the one and only Slavery North staff at the moment. Hi, Emily Davidson. Most of you know Emily. So Emily is our wonderful Director of Research and Engagement, and she does all things in the world of fellows, as well as many, many other things, too many to name, actually. The other thing I'd like to do is to thank Mellon, because none of this would be possible without a wonderful 3-year grant from the Mellon Foundation. So thank you so much to the Mellon Foundation for your support and your sanction of the good works that we're doing. The other thing I just want to point out is at the moment we have 2 fellowships call open, one for visiting professors and one's for artists in residence. So if you're interested in those categories and you're able to apply and you want to apply and come and join us, please check out the postings at slaverynorth.com for both of those fellowship opportunities. We also have a couple of job opportunities open. So the one I want to highlight is that UMass Amherst is supporting us by hiring an associate or a tenured professor of public history who will become my associate director. So that job call is open now. Yes, right? So there is a succession plan, people, in place, right? So if you know any professors who are interested in that position, it will be a history professor position, again, a public history professor. So that posting is now open as well. And you can find that also on our website. So I am really, really pleased. This is our first Black History Month event of many, hopefully to come in the future. And it is my very great pleasure and honor to introduce and welcome an esteemed scholar, colleague, and a dear friend, Professor Lisa Merrill, who is also a member of the Slavery North Advisory Board. So Dr. Merrill is going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and we're going to reserve 10 and 15 minutes at the end for questions and conversations with Dr. Merrill. Okay, so if you have any questions, please keep them in mind, and then Dr. Merrill will take those questions at the end. So just to introduce Dr. Merrill then. Professor Merrill is a professor of performance history in the Department of Writing Studies and Rhetoric at Hofstra University in Long Island, New York. Professor Merrill's research and publications are in the fields of performance studies, critical race and cultural studies, and women's history. Her numerous award-winning publications and invited lectures include the Eccles Center Visiting Professorship in North American Studies at the British Library for Performing Race and Reading Antebellum American Bodies, and that was 2010-2011. The Oscar Brockett Essay Prize for her essay, Most Fitting Companions, Making Mixed Race Bodies Visible in Antebellum Public Spaces in 2015. And recent lectures of Dr. Merrill's on race and representation have taken place at the University of Ghana in Accra in 2023, the Universidade Federal do Estado del Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 2023, the International Society for Theater Research in Reykjavik, Iceland in 2022, MESA, or the Multi-Ethnic Studies Association in Larnaca, Cyprus in 2022, Tate Modern Museum in London, England in 2022, and the International Museum for the Study of Slavery in Liverpool, England in 2017. So Dr. Merrill will be giving a lecture for us today entitled Representing the Amistad Rebellion in Art, on Stage, and to the Spectators, to the at the New Haven jail. Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all in the room and on Zoom. I'm very happy to be here today. As you heard, I'm a performance and cultural historian, so I specialize in spectatorship and visual rhetoric. And that's the lens that I will approach today's talk about representations of the Amistad mutiny. And I want to start with two quotes that kind of frame the way I approach things. The first is from playwright Bertolt Brecht, who said, as you see, art is not a mirror to reflect reality, but a hammer with which to shape. And the second, from the amazing writer and critic Bell Hooks, representation is a crucial location of struggle for any exploited and oppressed people, asserting subjectivity and the decolonization of the mind. So today we're going to look at these representations, live, embodied, and visual. Now, few cases of the escape from enslavement were more widely reported or represented visually than that of the Amistad mutiny, when on July 2nd, 1839, 53 Africans were kidnapped from Sierra Leone and rose up against those who were holding them captive. This is in Cuba, where they had been taken. And they were brought aboard the slaver Amistad. They killed the captain and cook and attempted to get the navigator, whom they had spared, to sail them back to Africa. The image that you see in front of you is a close-up of a painting that I'm going to talk about quite a bit. But for many people, this is the iconic image of the Amistad mutiny. And this comes from Nathaniel Jocelyn's portrait of Saint-Capet, which is probably the Mende pronunciation of the leader of the rebellion. He was known in the press at the time as Cinque. And I didn't mean to, okay. I've moved us along in the image, okay. So as we talk about the rebellion, I want to explore with you what the contradictory narratives about the rebellion and how that was represented in imagery, in live performances, and text. So I want you to think about how the spectacularization of Black bodies in a wide range of contexts were seen in this time period, the antebellum period, when the very rights, liberty, and the very humanity of people of color was being debated in the press, in court cases, on stage, and in visual representations. And I think that that sense of the spectatorship is absolutely essential to understanding what persons of color experienced at the time. And it can lead us to an understanding of the history of racism in the country today. So as you'll hear, the representations of the Amistad mutineers took a range of forms: paintings, panoramas, melodramatic theatrical representations, life-size waxed figures, life-size, in the act of mutiny. Much of the iconography highlights images of Cinque, who you just saw, and the performative encounters between spectators and representations of the rebellion. So a little bit of background before you look at this newspaper clipping that I have up for you. That's one of the first that recorded what happened. But background for those of you, I know people in Professor Nelson's class have been reading some of my work and have also seen films about Amistad. So some of you have a background. For those of you who don't, and especially on Zoom, on July 2nd, the kidnapped by Portuguese slave traders, illegally enslaved Africans from Sierra Leone were taken on a slaver ship called the Chocora to Cuba, where they were sold and then put on the captive aboard the ship Amistad, which ironically means friendship, right? And they were taken to be worked in a plantation further on in Cuba. But under the unofficial leadership of the guy whose image you just saw, they had a rebellion. They broke out of their chains. They rebelled against their captors. They killed 2 crew members, the captain and the cook, who was threatening to eat them. They seized control of the ship, and they attempted to sail home. They saved one of the navigators, one of the Spanish navigators, thinking he would sail them back to Africa, but they were tricked. What happened was during the day, it looked like the boat was going further east. At night, they were sailed north and along the east coast, and they were captured by the United States Navy brig, the Washington. And they were captured off the coast of Long Island, which is where I teach. And of course, New York had already, oh, sorry guys. New York had already abolished enslavement in 1827. They were sailed to Connecticut, where they were imprisoned. So this is very much a case of slavery north, and how that was seen at the time. So what you see in front of you here is a newspaper I held in my hand. This is one of the first accounts of seeing the slave ship and seeing the sailors. And what you see in the text, obviously it's too small to read, they reported, much excitement's been created in New York for the past week from the report of several boats having seen a schooner full of Negroes, and in such condition, it led to a suspicion that it was a pirate ship. So people passing by, seeing these Black men on board, didn't know what was happening. That was the first account. But this particular article, the New York Sun, August 31st, accounted for the capture. And what you can probably make out in the title there is the title of the article is The Long, Low, Black Schooner. And that title is going to be important. So the proprietor of this newspaper announced in this article that he had gotten somebody to do this woodcut that you see of the vessel, and that he also had commissioned a London artist, James Sheffield, to create a lithograph of Cinque so that people could see who was in charge of the rebellion. Now, what hasn't been thoroughly investigated, and certainly not looked at through a performance lens before, is the way this mutiny was recorded and performed. So what you see there is a playbill for 3 days after they were imprisoned in Connecticut. In New York, the leading theater, the Bowery Theater, was performing The Long, Low, Black Schooner days after they were captured. Gives you a sense of how live performance was the way people found out about daily. This is obviously before any other kind of media. So live performance and newspapers are how people found out about the news of the day. So the play had the same title as the article that you've just seen. And I have a close-up of, the close-up there, if you can see more of that, they advertise the Black Schooner, and under the title, it says piracy, mutiny, murder aboard the Amistad. And those are the things that were highlighted for spectators to come and see what all this news was about. Now, when we look at these playbills, the play script doesn't exist. One of the things I can tell you is that the actors who are enacting this mutiny were white. They were white, and they were probably blacked up using blackface. So because I'm a performance historian, I want to talk about this space where this happened. And the space was the Bowery Theater. And theaters were already liminal spaces, but this is located in Five Points, New York, the neighborhood that had the largest free Black community in New York, and also was a neighborhood where lots of immigrants lived, mostly Irish immigrants. So that's who was coming to see the play. And what did they see? Well, what they saw as they walked through the streets of New York, they attempted to go to this theater, the Bowery Theater, that the mainstream press at the time warned people about because it was in a neighborhood of impoverished people, again, the largest free Black community. It's also a space where in other work that I've done about New York and Black history in New York at this time, it's the place, the very place where blackface minstrelsy first started just 6.5 years earlier in the same theater. So a very racist white performer, T.D. Rice, premiered, you heard this term, his Jim Crow song and dance in blackface in the very same theater. So I want you to think about what spectators saw. They all knew what had happened in that space when they came to see this melodrama. And one of the things that I found out there, so here we have a sense of the relationship to 5 Points, and some of the press at the time describing it as a horrible circle, and that the residents, the denizens, are principally Irish and Negroes, not one American. So the way people are considering who is American and what's American while they're coming to see this melodrama was important here. And as we think about it, I was able to track from that playbill, it just says Proctor, but I realized that the person who was playing Cinque was this actor, and this actor here that you can see is John Proctor, and this is one of his other characters. He played a number of characters who were also Native people. He also plays violent characters. So he was described, as you can see here, as assuming a stern and forbidding aspect. This serves him well in the interpretation of passions of hate and revenge that dominate his successful characters. So he plays the evil person, right? He's playing Cinque in blackface. We have no images. By the way, photography is just invented this very year. It's 1839. So you'll see few photographs, but you'll see other kinds of representations. So what did people see when they saw these melodramatic performances? Now, Frederick Douglass, who I've done a lot of work on and writing about as well, didn't see this play, but he, as many Black people at the time, reacted very negatively to the horrors of blackface minstrelsy, although there are still apologists who claim that wasn't the case. But one of the things that I think is so important about Douglass here is Douglass's sense that people who do these minstrel performances are, as he said, the filthy scum of white society, who've stolen from us a complexion denied to them by nature in which to make money, and pander to the corrupt taste of their white fellow citizens. So that sense of this space, spatiality is very important in my work. So what's happening in this space as people are seeing a dramatization of the news of the day, literally the news of the day. So what about the actual people who were captive and sitting in jail while this play was going on just days after they were there? That was seen as a performance as well, because what you can see there is a letter to an editor of a New Haven newspaper. So they're in jail in New Haven, waiting the outcome of several trials to see if they're going to be freed, if they're going to be charged with murder, if they're going to be sent to back to Cuba or to Spain, or if they're going to be freed, which is the fortunate happy ending that we'll get to in a bit. But what you see here is a letter to the editor. And the letter to the editor here says, reacts to the way that the captors were being treated. Because for 12.5 cents, visitors to the prison could gaze at them. This is what first intrigued me when I saw in the New Haven Historical Society this particular newspaper clipping. And I said, this is a performance occasion, right? People are coming to the jail and paying to see people imprisoned. So the letter, again, I know you can't read the close-up, it says, an observer wishes to be informed whether it be a fact that the captured Africans now in our jail in this city are made merchandise of in their imprisonment by being actually exhibited to the curiosity and gaze of the populace, and that for a few paltry pence. By what authority is that traffic and show? And the writer goes on to say, it's an altogether slavish mercenary affair, if not piratical trade. I trust you'll denounce it as unfeeling, ungenerous, and unjust. So again, now who's being charged with being a pirate? The jailers, right? So the rhetoric of response here is really interesting. They're being charged with being slavish and piratical. And the exhibition is widespread. The editor wrote back in subsequent articles and said that a natural curiosity exists in the community to see these unfortunate beings. But in these command performances, the captives were surveilled against their will, and thousands of white spectators indulged their curiosity to see objectified and sexualized and often sparsely dressed Black bodies. On Friday, September 20th, again, just weeks after they had been incarcerated in the jail, the New Haven Daily Herald announced to readers, the Africans continue to attract great attention, and the most frequent inquiry in our streets is, which is the road to the jail? They were remarking that not less than 3,000 persons have visited them in jail in the last 3 days, 3,000 in 3 days. And one man stated on Tuesday that he had come 100 miles on purpose to see them. So the issue of spectatorship is really, and surveillance is really at the heart of this. Sorry. By October 1st, the New Haven papers said probably not less than 5,000 or 6,000 persons had visited them in their unfortunate confinement here. So let's think about what people saw when they saw the actual mutineers and how we can see the representations from the representations, how they were depicted in art. So what you see here is one of the earliest images. While they were being held in the prison, besides the spectators who were voyeuristically coming to see them, there were abolitionists who came to see them, and also artists, phrenologists, and other interested persons. And they produced images, engravings, a panorama that I'll talk about, the life-size wax figures that I'll talk about. And all of those were trying to capture for spectators who these people were who instigated the mutiny and how they should be regarded. So here you see an early image, one of the earliest images of Sangbe, drawn from life, as it says. But sorry, what did I do there? Okay. This is a hand-colored lithograph. And this is August 30th. So the very day that they're first in prison in New Haven, this artist is coming to do that picture of him. And what you see here is the leading of the title underneath, where it says the leader of the gang of Negroes who killed the captain and cook. So people who see that image also see the text. But the next day, the editor of The Sun had, remember I said, had commissioned another artist. And that artist here, James Sheffield, August 31st, produced this broadside close-up image of Sangbe. And this, again, I know you can't read the small print, so what I have for you here gives a different sense. And here it says, Joseph Sinke, the brave Congolese chief who prefers death to slavery and who now lies in jail in irons, awaiting his trial for daring for freedom. So the connection between image and text that's available to people absolutely shapes the way they understand what happened with this mutiny. Also at the time, a well-known Scottish phrenologist, George Combe, came to the Connecticut prison, measuring the heads. That's what phrenologists do, the kind of racist work of that notion, right? So he measured the heads of the Amistad captives, and he noticed all of the discussion that was being aroused by these images. And he said, the advocates of abolition represent them as heroes who've nobly risen against their oppressors and recovered their freedom at the hazard of their own lives. But the patrons of slavery designate them as pirates, murderers, and call for their trial and execution. So, how did art lead spectators to see either of those conclusions? What you see here is the cover and some images from a booklet by one of the artists who visited them in the jail repeatedly. And this is John Warner Barber, who self-published a 32-page booklet here. And these are two images from the booklet. The one on the bottom, the death of Captain Farrar, depicts the mutiny and the murder of the captain. And Barber's caption for that is, the African captives on board, in order to obtain their freedom and return to Africa, armed themselves with cane knives and rose upon the captain and the crew of the vessel. Up next to it, on top here, is another image that's really significant in this booklet. And that image, it's an engraving of 9 of the Amistad captives as they sat cramped and shackled together aboard the Takora. That's the ship that took them, the slaving ship, across the Atlantic. And what you see there is one of the only and earliest images of people who survived the Middle Passage. And how Warner Barber knew what they looked like is they were telling through translators, and we can talk about translation afterward. I know that interests Professor Nelson. But they told what happened when they were on board, and they acted out in their trials the positions they were forced to be in for weeks on end. So that's part of what is being represented here. Now, at the same time that Warner Barber is doing this booklet, narrating the whole story of what happened in the mutiny, other artists, where there are no images, are trying to replicate this as well. Stay with this for a sec. I told you about the wax figures. I've been looking for years to see if anybody had any illustrations of them. None of them exist, but Sidney Moulthrop, who was the artist who, again, measured the heads, did these images, did all kinds of, he took molds of their faces, samples of their hair, and he created 29 life-size wax figures of the Amistad captives. And he staged this scenario at the moment of their mutiny, right, which is also the murder of the captain. So imagine this, life-size, 29 life-size figures that tour. They were originally displayed at a Peale's Museum and Portrait Gallery in New York. This exhibit of 29 life-size figures toured to Boston, to Norwich, Connecticut, and to New Haven, and to other places as well. So I found the accounts of this. One of the accounts in Boston says, in these representations, everything is so exact. The countenances, height, dress, so nearly correspond to life that on first approach, you're in doubt whether the figures before you are not like yourself, endowed with life and motion. So think about what this is for spectators. They're seeing and surrounded by life-size wax figures of 29 strong Black men who are in the act of self-liberation. The spectators are absolutely interpolated into that performance. So that isn't the only way that spectators were involved. So here, what I want you to imagine is another piece of artwork that is not extant. but it's a letter that I've held in my hand describing a panorama. This was an enormous panorama, 135 feet long. It's conceived by the artist Amasa Hewins, who's a white man, who does this painting called the Magnificent Painting of the Massacre on board the Amistad. And it's important to know that panoramas, remember this is before there are films, right? Panoramas are this widespread, popular, one of the most popular forms of entertainment at the time. So, and many cities had buildings that were just made to exhibit panoramas. So spectators stand in the middle. There's a giant, here, this one was 135 feet, art piece that sometimes moves around them. Sometimes you just have to look, but you feel as though you are in the scene. Again, it puts the spectator in that place. So unfortunately, the images are not extant, but what we do have is this letter. And this letter by one of the people who was a spectator, Benjamin Griswold, writing to Lewis Tappan. Lewis Tappan is one of the heads of the Amistad Defense Fund. And Griswold had seen this panorama, and he was concerned about what people would think when they saw it. So he wrote to Tappan, who we'll talk about in a sec, and he says to Tappan that he spoke to the artist, and the artist claims that he believes in liberating the act of Cinque, liberating himself and his companions, and that he's not trying to prejudice people against the Amistad mutineers. Remember, they're not only in prison, but they're subject to a number of trials, right? So their fate is not known. What's going to happen to them is not known. But people are paying to see those wax figures, and they're paying to see and be part of this panorama. And the panorama, again, is highlighting the moment of mutiny, when to escape enslavement, they are executing the captain and the cook. That's what's being highlighted and what spectators are then in the middle of. And in panoramas, you're physically present in the scene as it either moves around you or as you look and imagine yourself in that place. Now, here you see Tappan, who received that letter. And the letter talked about, Griswold said, the moral effect of the painting, I think, will be bad. He's warning the people who are defending the Amistad mutineers that things like this, the wax figures, and particularly this panorama, will turn people or reinforce their racism against them. So what can we say about the response? The response is important. I think it's because of Griswold's letter, which is much longer. I just showed you the cover sheet of it. That because of Griswold's letter, Tappan, who, by the way, is from Northampton originally, so there's a couple of local folks here, even though they're living in New York at the time. Tappan is also the founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society. So he's not only working to help free the Amistad mutineers, he's also the founder of the first college in the United States that admits Black and women students, Oberlin College. He's a founder of that. So he has long committed to working against enslavement. Sorry. So he sees the letter. And what do they do? To use art and representation to countervail the images that spectators have seen. What you see here is a fabulous activist, abolitionist. This is Robert Purvis, whose work, not just as the head of the Amistad Defense Committee, which he bankrolled completely, She's a free Black philanthropist who was sometimes called the father of the Underground Railroad. So Purvis has got a real commitment to seeing not only that the Amistad mutineers are found not guilty and freed and able to go back to Africa, but to fight against enslavement in general. So Purvis, who, by the way, as a secondary school student, went to the Amherst Academy. So there's a couple of local folks in this story that I thought you might know. Purvis decides, besides providing all the finances for their defense, he decides to commission the portrait. And here you see the larger version of the portrait. So this is what we started with. But I wanted you to hear how the arts and spectatorship led to this moment. And who is this painter? He's the older brother of one of the people who was part of the Amistad Defense Committee. So he is a white painter, but he's already been committed to this. And that's an important part of who he is here. And what you see here is a quote, the quotes here too, from some people who saw this painting and and see in the painting a way to speak back against the representations of savagery, of violence. If we have time, we'll talk more about the way this painting is constructed. There's been lots of work about that. Sangbe in a toga, an African background, maybe biblical imagery, classical imagery, and we'll talk about the very intentional representation here of what Sangbe looked like to the people who recognized what he had been through. Henry Clark Wright wrote, as you see here, his dauntless look as it appears on canvas would make the souls of slaveholders quake. The portrait would be a standing anti-slavery lecture to slaveholders and their apologists. So again, the rhetoric of visual art, very intentionally constructed. The other thing is the timing is important here because remember the trials are going on. So Purvis is so smart. He's not only commissioning this painting, but as you'll see in a minute, he also commissions wide representations and the part of a print that is available to everyone. But first I wanted you to see how people reacted to the painting. So one of the letters that I found recently is from a white supporter of the Amistad mutineers who got to know them and visited in the prison. Not all of them were voyeurs. And Charlotte Coles wrote this letter to her brother Samuel, describing the painting when she first saw it. And she said, "Did I speak to you of the portrait of Sinking? Isn't it splendid? He and all of them are highly delighted with it. If it were a mere fancy piece, it would be valuable as art, but the likeness is perfect and the attitude most imposing. And the rest of the picture, which depended on the artist's taste, is admirable. The trees, the bamboo, let me just go back so you can see it. The trees, the bamboo, the African scenery in the background. When it was shown to Sinke, he said, oh, good, good. And she says, I don't wonder that he did. And this is the actual letter. So, you know, I'm kind of a person who hounds the archives. So here you're seeing the actual letter, right, that she wrote to her brother describing the painting and the reactions to the painting. Now, remember what I said, Purvis was so smart. He knew at this point, the case was being heard at the Supreme Court, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But before the painting was even finished, one of the things that Purvis did was arrange for it to be widely distributed in the form of this print. And it's in this way that most of the public came to see this image of Sinke. just 1 week before the Supreme Court justices adjourned to reach their final decision on the case. So this was widely available. It was in a range of newspapers. It was mass produced in the form of an engraving and a portrait, and people were invited to purchase it. So you see here, I have the text on the sale of the print of this mezzotint saying, we shall be proud to have in our apartments grazed with a portrait of the noble Cinque, and who that has any humanity in his heart or any veneration for a hero, and who has any knowledge of this case would not like to have this likeness about them. So it's widely advertised and sold. In this way, you can think about the portrait itself and the mezzotint as a quintessential example of visual rhetoric, one of the things I teach, and it serves as an important component to a well-timed, carefully orchestrated publicity campaign. And we see, Sangbe in the toga, we see the images, classical and biblical images here, and the ways that they functioned. So as you're looking at this, I want you to think about what people are seeing and thinking about while the trial's going on. Now, the trial. If you've seen that film, as I know some of you in Professor Nelson's class have, there have been a series of trials, right? There are lower court trials. This case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. It goes to the Supreme Court because Sierra Leone was a British colony, and Britain had already abolished enslavement. So the Portuguese slave traders who kidnapped all of the Amistad mutineers were violating all kinds of international agreements, right? And the former president of the United States, rose to their defense. It's pretty remarkable, right? This is a time where there's still enslavement in most of the US. The former president, John Quincy Adams, who was president for one term, 1825 to 1829, he was not reelected. He decided to run as a congressperson. So he was representing the state, Massachusetts. And he was in his 70s at the time that he was approached by the Amistad Committee to be the person who defends them before the Supreme Court. And he's an incredible speaker. On February 24th, the same day that image of the mezzotint is for sale, he speaks for 4 hours before the Supreme Court. He speaks again on their defense in early March. And if you know the story, if you've read either my piece or seen the film, you know what happened. They won. They won the case. March 9th, 1841. They won the case so that they would be free. They were not charged with murder. They were free to return to Sierra Leone. It's one of the only cases where enslaved and captured people won their case and were able to return home. It's really remarkable. So there you see Adams. And if we had more time, which we don't, I could tell you more about Adams' activism. It isn't only this case, but he continued to be speaking against enslavement for all of his career. He and his father, the second president, John Adams, were two of the only of the founding fathers of the United States who were not slaveholders. So they were constantly besieged in terms of the way they took that on. So what happened to the painting, to that beautiful painting? Well, once they were freed, they returned to Sierra Leone, and we can talk more about that if we have time. Provost had the painting and wanted everybody to see it. So he donated it. They donated it to the Philadelphia Artists Fund Society Gallery, where everybody could see, because remember, slavery is still going on throughout the United States. The gallery refused. They declined to hang the painting, claiming that to display it would prove injurious both to the proprietors and to the institution. It might hurt sales of other members' work or spark riots if it was exhibited. They were furious. Think about the power of that painting and the resistance to that painting. So Henry Clark Wright, again, a white abolitionist, good friend of Provost, wrote an angry response to the abolitionist paper, the Pennsylvania Freeman. It was reprinted in the Liberator, Frederick Douglass's paper. And he talked about how what they called the hanging committee, think about the irony of that, right? The hanging committee that refused it. And the quote you see here is part of Wright's letter, where he says, slavery stands as a doorkeeper to that gallery and says nothing enters here that will give offense to Negro haters and Negro stealers. And he speculates in the longer letter that if the painting were exhibited, viewers couldn't help but see the grace and dignity and nobility of Sangbe, and they'd be led to question the whole practice of slavery and turn the gallery into an anti-slavery meeting. So again, the power of the art, the fact that it was refused. So the painting was not exhibited. It went back to Purvis's house, but something very special happened there. Remember, I said that Purvis was the father of the Underground Railroad in Philadelphia, especially. And he had lots of people who were self-liberating fugitives come through his home. As the painting was brought back to his house, Madison Washington, a man who had escaped enslavement, was in Purvis's house and saw the painting and heard the story of the mutiny and the wonderful result that they were freed and returned to Africa. And he was inspired. Shortly after that, Madison Washington was recaptured himself. He was going south to get his wife out of enslavement. But knowing the story and having seen that painting, he staged his own mutiny. He was enslaved on a ship, a slaver called the Creole. He mutinied, and he knew what happened to the Amistad people when they were sailed to states that still had slavery. Connecticut didn't abolish till 1848. So he sailed south to the Bahamas. Remember, Britain had abolished enslavement, and he and all of the people on the Creole were freed. So again, oh wait, one sec. Again, we have a sense of how that painting served a double rhetorical purpose and influenced the attitudes toward the resistance to enslavement and encouraged subsequent Black resistance to enslavement in that case. Now, what I found not that long ago is this image of Frederick Douglass. This is a piece of sheet music. Douglass had spent some time in Britain, and as he was leaving, people, the British abolitionists, including Julia Griffiths, wrote a song to celebrate the fact that Douglass had been there and was coming back to the United States and being part of the fight against enslavement. But look at how they depict Douglass. Doesn't it give you echoes of the importance that remains in the images of Singé? I mean, Frederick Douglass, if you've ever seen photographs, he was the most photographed person in the entire 19th century. He is always very distinguished. He's wearing a tie and a jacket. He's given wonderful lectures about the lesson of the hour, about how Black people should be depicted. So Douglass is never wearing a toga. But I think this is a visual reference to the image that everybody had seen of Sangbe. And there were people who made that connection and talked about the two of them together. Douglass was so influenced by the story of Sangbe that his only piece of fiction, The Heroic Slave, is a retelling of the Madison Washington story. And what you see here is a little picture that I took in Douglas's last home, the Frederick Douglass National Historical Site in Washington. And over, well, now it's off to the side, initially over Douglas's desk is the mesoprint of Sengbei. So he kept that always, and that was an important inspiration to him, that Sargent print. So just as we're getting toward the end here, I want you to think about how these images function. Henry Clark Wright predicted in his letter to the Emancipator that I read you part of, that Sengbei will continue to be an object of interest. His name will be the watchword of freedom to Africa and her enslaved sons throughout the world. What you see here is, again, a close-up of the Jocelyn painting that we know, but also an image of a collage by Romare Bearden. And I wanted you to see them side by side so you see how much Bearden is using both the Sengbei image, right? You can see that, and also the Barber image, the very bottom, right? He's put them together in that way. Romare Bearden, for those of you who are art historians, know, was an amazing contemporary Black artist. He was so moved by the story of Sengbei and this image initially that in 1969, Bearden founded a gallery called the Sengbei Gallery in New York. It exhibited the work of new and established African-American artists. It provided community educational programs. And for more than 3 decades, that gallery sponsored more than 300 exhibitions in New York City venues and regional touring exhibits. This collage that you see here is from 1971. So he started the gallery first, then he did the collage there. And you see in that sense the influence that the story of Sengbei and the role of the visual art had in playing and letting people know that the importance of the story and the visual. Celeste Marie Bernier has written that in doing this piece, what Bearden does is situate the exemplary Sengbei and the Amistad Rebellion within the context of the civil rights struggles in the US in the 1970s. Because think about the galleries founded in 1969, this is the 1970s, and looking at the importance. So in conclusion, now over, oh, sorry guys, I didn't mean to do that.
Well, we could just,
yeah,
you can just
you can
unshare.
Unshare that, yeah. Yeah, just wanted you to see that last image. So in conclusion, over 170 years later, the Amistad mutineers and their rebellion to escape enslavement remain a powerful symbol. And the visual and performance art and the role of spectatorship through which people encountered and were interpolated into their story, I claim is a very important part of that freedom call. And today, this very moment, I think it's more important than ever that the artifacts, relics, words, performative protest, and the importance of resistance of people of color in the past and those few allies who risked their lives too in a fight for freedom and equality have to be uncovered, interpreted, and celebrated. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Professor Merrill. So now we have some time for questions and comments. And students, please feel free, because you're coming in with some background on this too. So you saw the movie, and Professor Merrill is able to speak to us if you have questions about what was fact and what was fiction in that movie, because she's enlightened me to the fact that, for instance, several Black abolitionists were amalgamated into that character of Morgan Freeman. Right. So what was done for expediency, what was really factual, and what was not, right? But just at the top, I just want to make a comment. Also, too, for everybody online, if you have a question, you could type it in the chat, or I think you can wave your hand, unmute and unmic, and we'll throw it over to you as well. But off the top, I'm sure a lot of us are thinking this, but I'm like, who has the power to turn someone else's pain and suffering into a spectacle? That's a huge part of this, right? In terms of how they were treated in the jail and who has the power to turn someone else's acts of self-preservation and self-defense into a spectacle. So just to start us off, Lisa, I was wondering, it always struck me because you've told us, the students, the audience knows this, slavery happened in the US North, hence, slavery North, why we're all here. It's just not being studied today. So slavery was going on in Connecticut. You pointed out this is why the Navy ship, I guess, picked them up off the coast of New York where slavery had been abolished and sailed them to Connecticut on purpose so that they can incarcerate them. Okay. But when they're in the jail and they become this spectacle, it strikes me as, okay, why? Because slavery had been going on in Connecticut for decades, if not centuries. Black people were in Connecticut. So what was so unique about that group or what they had done to compel thousands of people to visit? And, I'm going to throw this out to you. We've chatted about this before, of course, but was it the Africanness? So by this time in Connecticut, the majority of Black people would have been African American. And you notice in the film, guys, that a lot of them, when they go and start to try to find a Mende speaker, all right, most of the Black people just look at them like, what are you saying, right? They have lost their African language by that point. So they are now African American. But here you have a group of Africans with scarification who have filed teeth, right? Distinctive linguistics, cultural practice, etc. And the other thing, Lisa, was it also what made them so desirable as a so-called attraction was that they were self-liberated through this violent means. And while it was ubiquitous in slavery for white people to be violent against Black people, to the point of sadly becoming mundane, it wasn't news anymore. But for Black people to be in defense of self to the point of killing white people was like, wait a second, right? So could you speak to what was it about this group that made them such an attraction in the jail?
Okay, this is a great question. So the second part of your question first. There are a lot of allusions in the descriptions of all of them, but especially Cinque, of Spartacus, of heroes. And the fact that the rebellion is a rebellion against not just enslavement, and remember also the enslavers were Spanish, right? So these are not people who were part of slavery in the US. So that's part of the way that they got out. But they had never been enslaved. And one of the cases was they were kidnapped from Sierra Leone, which is why all the identification and linguistic presentation. They were also probably members of a secret society, the Poro Society. Not all of them were Mende speakers, but the vast majority were. And so that sense of free people who had just been captured at the time that enslavement was abolished in a range of other places. And again, pirates, Spanish pirates continued. Slavery continued, but the transatlantic stuff had stopped here. So I think part of what drew people twofold, right? One is liberating oneself against oppression. That narrative in terms of the founding of the United States was so prevalent that in many of these newspaper accounts that were favorable to the Amistad mutineers, they make the case, right? This is what a hero does when they are oppressed. A hero fights back. He's Spartacus. He has these religious images. So there's that. The other thing in terms of what draws spectators, I think you're absolutely right. It's the Africanness that they see. What I didn't tell you is that series of letters to the editor also talked about, are they warm enough? It's Connecticut in the winter. They came half dressed, but are people coming to look at them, right? So there's the combination of voyeurism and concern. Right? So there are some people of all kinds. I know in the Spielberg film, we don't see the thousands of voyeurs who are coming. We also don't see the way white spectators interpolate themselves into the story in those incredible examples of wax figures and panoramas that I think we really need to think about in terms of how the spectacle functions and the way people respond to it. So in answer to your great question, Charlotte, I think it's both. I think it's the absolute Africanness
Mhm.
of the mutineers. And it's also the sense of encountering people who have taken this heroic stance. And so the positive press is always making these allusions between the Amistad mutineers and people, even in the founding of the United States, who fought against some kind of oppression. And so the rhetoric works on both sides.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Any questions from the audience? And again, even if it's just points of clarification about distinctions between what Professor Merrill has shared in the film or anything like that. Don't be shy, everybody.
As Professor Nelson knows, I love to talk about this stuff.
Yeah,
We've done a long podcast. You can ask me anything, and I'm happy to talk to you about this more, because I think what's important, you know, a lot of different disciplines have tackled this amazing story. I know when I tell my students that this happened, there was a mutiny, and in fact, the white captain and cook were killed in the mutiny, and they got off. They were defended by the former president of the United States in the Supreme Court, and they went home to Sierra Leone. How many of you have heard that story before you read that article or saw the film?
Couple? Right. Just one?
One person.
Just one. Okay.
Okay.
So Lisa, I just want to tell you, Professor Bernstein says brilliant. Oh. Audrey says absolutely incredible. And James Coy Hudson is on there too, saying great things about your. Did you advised him? I was right? Fantastic. Yeah. Some fans. Okay.
He's now Dr. Hudson.
Okay. So I just want to throw out to you then. Okay, so you painted a picture for us of all the people who are trying to exploit the captive for profit, but then here comes Purvis. Were there other people like Purvis who were trying to raise money on their behalf, seeing how they went through not one, but two, but three trials? Like who was trying to, okay, they're improperly dressed. Who's trying to raise money to bring clothing to the jail and proper footwear, et cetera? Is there a narrative there too?
Yeah, there is a committee, right? So the committee, and Louis Tappan and his brother Arthur Tappan are really foundational in terms of that committee. There's also, in terms of space, this area, New Haven and New London, Connecticut, although slavery has not officially abolished until 1848, there's the gradual diminishment of slavery. And there is an abolitionist group within that community. And some of the artists that I've talked about and other people who are supporters would be part of that community as well, so that it's happening right in front of them there. But in terms of the fundraising, this is the kind of thing that Purvis is really the person who bankrolls most of it. The Tappans are the organizers. They also help when the Amistad captives go back to Sierra Leone. They help with financing that return voyage because they're freed, but there's no money for them. So part of what happens, and I wish we had more time for this, is that there's a series of, for my purposes, performative big mass meetings where Sangbei and some, not all, of the mutineers are present. Some of them by then had English, other people were translated, and people came mass abolition meetings to see them and to contribute to the fundraising. But that's organized to some extent by that whole committee. The Tappans are a big part of that. One of the things I didn't say about the neighborhood of the Bowery, 5 Points, just outside of that was Tappan's home, and there had been a big race riot, which I hope you know, means white people attacking people of color in that very neighborhood in 1834. This is 1839 when this happens, and Tappan's home was destroyed at part because of his abolition. So the sense of who's fundraising, who's organizing, there are important allies, but I think the most important is Purvis, right? He is a free Black man. He has seen all of this. He continues to B, that's why he's kind of, called the father of the Underground Railroad. And, he inherited incredible wealth from the white father and a black mother who were about to go to England because they couldn't be married in the United States. But there were the adult children, one of whom went to school right here. But inheriting all of that wealth, he used it all for, there's a great plaque outside his Philadelphia house. And Philadelphia is a big area for abolition at the time. So I think the answer to your good question, Charmaine, is Purvis is really behind it. There are other Black abolitionists, Black preachers. William Still is a big part of the Underground Railroad. I haven't been able to identify his connection with Amistad yet, but in the Spielberg film, you get the impression that there's only one Black person who's part of this, and that's not true. There were lots of Black abolitionists and people like Frederick Douglass who absolutely spoke out and saw both the dangers of misrepresentation and the horrors of enslavement that he had experienced himself.
Okay, and I think we do have a question, and I'll go to Olivia. So maybe we'll take both questions, Lisa, and make sure you get to both of them. Mm-hmm. So online, A. Rice, can you, there, go ahead.
Yeah, hello. I'm Professor Alan Rice, University of Central Lancashire in Preston. Really like that talk, Lisa, but I was just wondering about the panorama and how early this is as far as panoramas go, and what other panoramas were used in kind of abolitionist modes. I'm particularly thinking of Henry Box Brown using his panoramas in Britain, and what links you see between these kind of abolitionists kind of modes, where because it takes an awful lot to make a panorama, and it just seems to me that they're kind of quite incredible things, and the only reason we don't speak about them more is that none of them have survived. All we have is descriptions. We don't have the things themselves. So I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more to, how early this was in terms of panoramas and how it relates to later abolitionist panoramas.
Okay.
Thank you so much. And can we get one more question?
Yes,
you can answer them both. Thank
sure.
you so much, Professor. And Olivia?
Hi. I was just thinking about how captains of slave ships are rarely the owners of the slave ships, and if we had any information about who owned the Amistad, and also if you could clarify more about whether the slaving sailors were Spanish or Portuguese. I heard you go back and forth, so I wasn't sure.
Right.
So we'll finish up with those two questions.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
So they're in two different directions. Let me take Alan's first.
Okay.
And it's nice to see you. He's an old friend. And certainly Henry Box Brown, William Wells Brown had large panoramas, and they used that as part of educating people about abolition. There were panoramas about Uncle Tom's Cabin. This panorama, the Hewins panorama, 1840, I think, it's a complicated story because Ewins claimed to Griswold that, he was doing this in support of them. And yet he's emphasizing images of a kind of savagery, right? So that's why Griswold was concerned. In answer to Alan's question, there were panoramas all through the Civil War. There's a big Gettysburg panorama where there are still some pieces of it left. And every major city in the US, in the UK, in Europe, had purpose-built buildings in the round for panoramas. In these decades before cinema, this was a way to imagine your body in space. So it became a fabulous abolition tool. And so I know in terms of Alan's own good work, that sense of the abolitionist movement, transatlantic, made great use of the panoramas. Hewins I'm a little concerned about because before he was a painter, I found that he did some work selling things from the West Indies and the Caribbean. So remember, he's making money every time people pay to see the panoramas that travel. So unlike William Wells Brown and Henry Box Brown, themselves self-liberated Black men who use this tool in that way, Hewins, I think, is someone that we should really be more concerned about his motive. And now in the room, your lovely question about the complications there. The people who captured and kidnapped the Amistad mutineers were Portuguese, right? They took them to Cuba. There had been an arrangement between the US and Spain that they would not continue to promote enslavement. So it had ended in England. There was a violation here. What they did when they were in Cuba, they sold the Amistad mutineers, and there wasn't a mutiny yet. They sold them to two Spanish slave traders, Ruiz and Montes, who put them on the slaving ship, the Amistad, to take them just further into Cuba to be worked as slaves. And in part of the court cases, one of the issues was, well, were they already enslaved? And they were not, right? They were free people just captured in that way. And that's part of the kind of narrow definition that got them off. Because I know when I first read this, I thought, why didn't that end slavery for everybody, right? The Supreme Court made this announcement, but it was really on these small conditions about the relationship between the US and Spain, between England and the UK, well, it wasn't the UK then, but England and Spain and the US that enabled them to be free, and the brilliance of John Quincy Adams putting all of that together. So I hope that answers your question. Montes and Ruiz were the owners of that ship. I don't know who owned the Tacora. It was Portuguese pirates who kidnapped them, but I don't know who owned that. Thank you
so much.
Thanks.
We'll have the last question
Thank
here.
you for a great talk. I have a brief question and then a comment. The question is, the Coles that you mentioned, do they have an Amherst connection? Because there's a big Amherst family named Cole.
I don't know, but I'd love to look into that.
That's also kind of fascinating. Yeah, they own a lot of land, and I think just donated some to the Nipmuc tribe back. Actually, Jace gave land back, which is amazing, but if they're a local family. So my comment is actually, I teach with Professor Nelson art history, and I'm about to give a tour tomorrow at the Art Museum where there's a show, Contemporary Layla Ali, and there's a series of Nat Turner drawings. So it's a really interesting, totally different ending to that story, because Nat Turner's rebellion, as you know, 1831 in Virginia.
Right.
And so they caught everybody. There was this rebellion, also described as a massacre in this kind of spectacle term that kind of caught everyone's imagination, because it was the plantation owner's worst nightmare, a successful rebellion, but then they put everyone to death because of Virginia. So totally different outcome. But she has a really fascinating series of contemporary drawings where she imagines herself in dialogue with Turner and like dealing with the visions and some of the crazy signs he saw from God that led to it. So I just wanted to throw that out there for everyone to see that authority.
Thank you, and I'd love to see that as well. And I'm going to look to see about the Coles connection.
Yeah,
that's great. I also think that one of the ways that the Amistad people got off in the way that Turner and the Rebellion and other rebellions like the Stoner Rebellion and all of those didn't, is because the people who had captured them were not American, right? They were, so it was the Portuguese and the Spanish, right? And so that was a whole different story. They could say that is other than what was happening here.
Okay, and there's one, we'll end with this question here, or comment?
Yeah, mine is about insurance. How did cargo, because it was human cargo, how did cargo turn against the captains, and how would the insurance take that?
Okay, I don't know about on the Tacora. I know more about the slave ship Zong, where some of you may know that horrendous story where so many enslaved Africans were thrown to their death, and because the slave owners got more money from the insurance than they could sell of these human beings, right? So insurance plays into this case to some extent in the lower court cases when there's a debate about should they be sent back to Cuba, right? Does the Spanish government have any financial interest, right? Because Cuba is a colony of Spain. Do they have a financial interest in them being sent back where they would be sold? So that there is some important financial question there too. And I think in all of these cases, your good question shows how the horrors of reducing humans to property and trying to put a financial value on them gets debated within the court systems. And that's part of it here too. I don't have more of the insurance case for the Chicora though.
Thank you all so much for coming. I'll just throw out that we'll be having at Slavery North 5 Fellows Talks this semester. So please stay tuned for that. Thank you all online as well. And thank you, Dr. Merrill, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you for welcoming me. I'm so happy to be on the advisory board here. It's a wonderful place.
Thanks, students. See you soon.